Good evening. Welcome to our Old Testament studies. We're here on Genesis. We've made it as far as chapter 20 this week, our Sunday night Old Testament class. And we just finished with 19 last week. Remember the Sodom and Gomorrah story? Here's kind of an introduction for you. It's like God don't have a lot of witnesses and people at this point in history. He's got Abraham and Sarah and Lot and his family. And Lot and his family were supposed to be the light that was in Sodom, but they didn't do any good. But still, God had to destroy that city. Even Lot's wife got destroyed with it. Some of his son-in-laws, maybe even some daughters. I don't know how many he had, but two of them escaped with him. But made the point that he got his daughters out of Sodom, but he didn't get Sodom out of his daughters. We got up on the mountain, and they was drunk and got their daddy got them pregnant, and Lot was the father to his own grandchildren. That's supposed to be God's man. That's kind of the state of it was. But if it was not for the New Testament over in Peter, I'd think, man, I'm not sure that Lot was even God's man. But Peter says he was that righteous Lot whose soul was vexed living in that city of Sodom day by day when he saw the ungodly deeds that they were doing. So that wears on you. The culture can kind of change you, don't it? And it's not for the better. Well, now we're going to see Abraham. Abraham's God's number one man. He's the friend of God, the Bible calls him. He believed God, and God counted it for righteousness. But now, here's a chapter that don't look so good on Abraham, chapter 20 here. Abraham, after the Sodom thing, he journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. And he'd come into this new area. And we're going to find out Abraham was kind of afraid of his life. So anywhere he went, he told Sarah, so tell them you're my sister. They're liable to kill me because you're so pretty. Tell them that you're my sister. And Abraham said of Sarah's wife, she's my sister. And Abimelech, who was the king of Gerar, where he had journeyed to, he took Sarah, took as into his harem. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, thou art but a dead man. For the woman which thou hast taken, she's a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. He had took her into his harem, but he hadn't been with her yet. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Now think about that. Abimelech, this old king down here in the south country, he said, Lord, would you also slay a righteous nation? He's saying, I haven't done anything wrong, but I heard what you did to Sodom and Gomorrah up there. And I agree, they deserved it, but were you going to slay a righteous nation too? Said he not unto me, she's my sister? In other words, he said, I didn't do nothing wrong. He said it was his sister. And she, even herself, said, he's my brother. And Abimelech, the old pagan king now, he said, in the integrity of my heart, integrity is when you're doing the right thing even when nobody's watching you, and in the innocency of my hands have I done this. I didn't mean to take another man's wife. He said as his sister, and she said as his brother. Now, we've got a sad picture right here in the world. The pagan is acting more righteous than God's people are. Why is this? So God said to him in a dream, yea, I know, God knew, that thou did this in the integrity of your heart. In other words, he agreed with the pagan, said, you did that in the integrity of your heart. And God says, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. And I think that means that's a little thing called the providence of God. It was probably like every time old Abimelech was getting ready to go be with this new bride in his harem, there'd be some kind of business or something crop up and he'd get pulled away. And he said, I never even got to be with her. And God says, yeah, that was me. That's what we call providence. And it happens to us a lot too, I believe. You ever doing something like this? I've thought of this a lot of times. In a hurry to go somewhere and you jump out the door and you're getting in the truck, getting ready to go. And doggone it, I forgot something. You have to run back in the house, and you was already in a hurry, and you get in the truck, and you take off down the road, and you're down the road a few miles, and there's been a terrible wreck. And you realize if I hadn't went back in the house, I might have been right in the middle of that. That might have been me. And you think, that was probably the providence of God that I wasn't in that. Many, many little things like that happen that we're unaware of sometimes that may be the providence of God. And that was what's going on with old Abimelech here. God said, you would have been with her, but if it wasn't for me, I withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore I suffered or allowed thee not to touch her. Verse 7. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he's a prophet. Abraham's a prophet. And he shall pray for thee. It's kind of interesting, and you'd think, sounds like old Abimelech ought to have been praying for Abraham. But Abraham was a man of faith, and even though he wasn't right in this case, see, the greatest people of faith are still fallible human beings. None of us are perfect. We get together and we celebrate God's grace and forgiveness in our life. That's what church is all about. It's not that we're singing, oh, how great we are. We're singing about, oh, how great he is, how great thou art. So he says, you give me his wife back, and Abraham will pray for you, and you'll live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants, and he told all these things. Now, here's a fine line. God doesn't do anything sinful, but God used the circumstances here. It's actually a sinful circumstance that woman's in there anyway. But if that hadn't have happened, God was able to use that as a witness of himself. Abimelech meets God in this dream, and God's warning him. Abimelech gets all of his people together and says, I met the true and the living God in my dream. And he begins to tell about this God instead of some pagan God. So Abimelech, verse 8, he told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, what hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. Now here's the pagan king preaching to God's man, and he's in the right. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? Or what were you thinking? And Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God's not in this place. We're in this pagan place of Gerar, and they'll slay me or kill me for my wife's sake. And yet, indeed, she is my sister. She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And that means that Sarah was actually Abraham's half-sister. And we're living in the age that we'd say, yuck. But remember, this is before the law of Moses was given, after the earth had become more and more populated. And the reason that we don't marry close kin people is because of the genetic flaws. But early on, there wasn't anybody left but close kin. But by the time we get up to Moses' day, he limits it to you can't even marry your first cousin. It has to be out beyond that. But in Abraham's day, it was a different time, different circumstances. It was probably more of a normal sin to them. But the way Abraham's using it here, he's telling this old pagan king, said, I didn't lie to you. I just told you a half lie. She's my sister, and she is my wife. Well, a half lie is probably a whole lie in God's eyes. She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And it came to pass when God caused me to wander. Now, think about this. God caused them to leave Ur of the Chaldees. They were like the first Hebrews, which means wanderers, became father and mother to all the nation of Israel, biologically. And so God called them out from Ur of the Chaldees. They stepped out on faith, but even though they stepped out on faith, they still had a lot of fear. Abraham says, hey, we're going to be wandering around as nomads living everywhere. And said, honey, said, you sure are pretty. He said, they'll kill me for you. Said, anywhere we come, said, you just go ahead and tell them you're my sister. What was Abraham thinking? When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness which you'll show unto me. At every place whither we come, say of me, he's my brother. And Abimelech, he took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants, and he gave them to Abraham. Now, you think Abraham done wrong and he still got blessed, but that ain't the point. I think Abraham was just God's man, and he noticed everywhere he went, not so much because of what Abraham have done, but in spite of it, God was still blessing Abraham. Abimelech gave him all the men servants, maid servants, sheep, and oxen. He gave him land, restored to him Sarah his wife, and Abimelech said, Behold, my land's before thee, dwell where it pleases thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he's to thee a covering of the eyes. I think that means you shouldn't be looking at other men. He's a covering of under your eyes. Unto all that are with thee and with all other. Thus Sarah was reproved. Now who's reproving? The old pagan, and he's right. But you know what? I believe the old pagan king Abimelech here has become a believer in the true and the God of Israel, we'll call him at that point too. So Abraham prayed to God, and God, see, Abimelech blessed God's man, and now God blesses Abimelech. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech. It's going to be the end of the line, but now God's restored all of that, because it had done that because of Sarah's wife, or Abraham's wife. So they all end up blessed, but it's kind of a sad story among the people of God here, how this happened. But that just once again reaffirms something about the Bible to me. If you were going to write a book about your favorite hero, and you went and did all the research and found all the information that you could find, well, say if you found the skeleton in a closet somewhere, so to speak, you might think, well, this is my hero. I'm not putting this in my book. I'm just going to put all the good things that he did. Well, the Bible drags the skeletons from the closet right out into the living room floor and shines the light on them, don't it? And all the way through there, people like King David. You know, he was a man after God's own heart, but boy, we see his flaws all through there too, don't we? People like Paul, you know, God's greatest evangelist of the New Testament, wrote most of the New Testament, but then we find out early on, the skeleton's in the closet, that he was an unbeliever at one time, consenting to the death of Christians, holding the coats and voting for him to stone old Stephen to death. We wouldn't write things like that, because they'd be our heroes, and we'd want to put them in the best light that we could. But that tells me that it wasn't just men that wrote this book we call the Bible. God, the Holy Spirit, was involved in it, and he put it all in there. And it just makes me see the hand of God in this book. It also tells me that no matter where you and I are as Christians, that God can still use us. All we got to do is get right with him and stay right with him. And when we get out here and sin, we got to come back. But we're human beings. But like all these great heroes of the faith, we're full of flaws, but hopefully we're full of faith to overcome the flaws too. See you next week. God bless you.